Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Dr. Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur. In this week, we will start talking about language. Now, language, as I have stressed in one of my earlier lectures as well, or also probably in the introduction part, language is one of the more important cognitive functions that we are actually using almost all the time, from thinking about the world to describing the world to talking about the world. Also in some senses understanding the world. One of the major tools that we are using is language. Unless you are basically only thinking in images, and we've probably had this discussion when you're talking about knowledge as well, that language is one of the more basic things, one of the most peculiar aspects of human behavior. So, in this week we will try and learn about various aspects of language. In today's lecture, I will probably give you some basic introduction about what language is, what are the relevant questions to ask about language, and how have people started looking at language, what is the scientific study of language called, what does it look like, what are the various components. Moving ahead, in the week we will talk about language in terms of at least 3 or 4 different processes. There is actually a lot to talk about language. If you come to the study of language, there is there is a lot of information that needs to be talked about or discussed. But again, this course is not really on language, and we have to cover language as one of the basic cognitive functions. So what I will try and do here is that I will try and divide this structurally into those particular topics, and we will see if we can give 1 or 2 lectures to each of these topics, and in some sense cover language in some depth. One of the reasons for doing this also is that language is slightly closer to the kind of work I do. So, I will probably try and have different lectures on language, things like introduction to language, properties of language, or let us say language acquisition and language comprehension, and things about reading or bilingualism in different topics spread throughout this week and the next one. So, it will be slightly a bit more lectures on language, but then that is what is needed to really convey the different amount and the huge amount of information there is to be talked about. Also, because language is one of the most important cognitive processes that we deal with and we talk about, we use on a daily basis. So, let us begin today's lecture. And one of the first questions that that kind of brings us to the study of language is this question. And again, one of the scientists asked it, and I probably quoted it from somewhere. And the question is that if you think of different cognitive functions, and we've talked about attention, perception and memory in the earlier course, and we are going to talk about things like knowledge and visual imagery and language, problem solving, decision making, creativity, all those different kinds of things. In these cognitive functions, one of the things that kind of most basically sets apart the human race from the rest of the animal kingdom, so is this is the question that you would want to ask. And again, the answer to this question is it's probably language. Let us try and see why it is. Nowadays, if you look around, if you look at the newspapers, or if you go to any of the social media websites, you can actually have a look at this cartoon which I've drawn from the web. And nowadays it's kind of interesting that even very sensitive pieces of information, even very important pieces of information that you might want to sometimes share very selectively, or sometimes you might want to be reserved about sharing those things, are kind of discovered through things like social media. And a lot of people are, by the way, consciously and voluntarily coming and sharing a lot of stuff about their personal lives. So, most of that, a lot of that is through language, a lot of that is through things like tweets and status messages and whatnot, WhatsApp messages for that matter. So language in that sense is helping us interact with the world. There is almost what is referred to as the total blast of social media, and there is so much importance and there is so much discussion that is going around nowadays with the amount of information that is floating around on different social media platforms. You can see Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, wherever you look at. YouTube, by the way, is a medium where you will have probably less of language but more of images and videos. But again, there is a lot of language. When you look around, and it's almost like an information overload, and this is probably what will make you wonder. And this is what Daniel Everett says in response to this, that nothing sets Homo sapiens humans apart from other species more clearly than the possession of language. See, for example, it might be possible that the perceptual processes or the attentional process or this or some decision making processes are there in other species as well, and obviously maybe not to the kind of extent that humans have, and not to that kind of sophistication that humans have, but something that very clearly sets us apart is this possession of language, and is also the possession of culture and those kind of things. So Daniel Everett lays a lot of emphasis on the fact that humans have language, and which is again a social entity. I mean, language is basically part of our culture, and there is a lot of crosstalk between what languages and what cultures, what different cultures are, and how languages affect cultures, or cultures affect particular languages. We'll try and see in a series of lectures on language how these kind of things are interplaying. So just to cut the story short, language is one of the most unique, one of the most differentiating aspects of the human species, and we will in the course of the next few lectures try and understand what are the different aspects of language and how are they important for understanding human cognition. How do they fit the bill for so many other cognitive abilities that the humans have. So let us try and move ahead. Here we actually refer to in Everett's quote that language is something that sets apart the human species, but some of us might wonder why is it that we are saying language is unique to humans, because probably animals also talk, they can communicate between each other, and they can warn each other of by using alarm calls, they can call each other by having mating calls and different kind of things. So why is that not language, and why is this that we are saying that humans have uniquely have language? Okay, so that is one of the thoughts that people might have. And one of the things we'll probably do in this first lecture is look at whether animals use language. I mean, do they use communication or do they use language, and is there a difference between communication and language? Now, just to describe this fact, communication is considered to be a much broader set. Okay, so communication can be through different kind of vocal gestures, different kind of manual gestures, moving your hands, making different kinds of shapes with your hands, or say for example making different kinds of sounds from your mouth, which might not be words, which might not be language, but again, and animals seem to be doing something very similar. So I have here borrowed again from the internet some of these examples of animal communication. Say for example, cobras, snakes, basically cobras inflate their hoods in order to scare out other creatures. They are sending out a message, and some of us might ask, is that not what language is supposed to do, send out messages? You can also look at different other examples. Say for example, elephants use their trunks to talk to other herds over long distances. So in some sense they are communicating, they are using some way to be able to talk to herds which are far apart. So again, is that not what language is supposed to do? Maybe talk over a phone nowadays, but again, transmit a message from here to the other person, and the other person listens and responds. So again, there are so many examples, and if you look up the internet and you try and read about different kinds of animals, you will realize that almost all animal species are using some or the other ways of communicating, whether it could be chemical, whether it could be visual, or it could be tactile, or it could be auditory, but there are different modes of communication that animals are following. So let us try and make this difference between why are these communication systems not referred to as language, and what is so special and what is so unique about language that we ascribe it, or we say that language belongs to humans only. So let us move ahead. So the answer to this question is that no, these different communication systems that I have just referred to, or I am just talking about, do not qualify to be called language. They might at best be called very rich symbolic communication systems. So for example, a particular kind of a vocal noise made by particular kinds of monkeys, say vervet monkeys, when they say a tiger, or when they say a snake on the ground, or whether when they say a eagle in roaming around and hunting, that is basically just a very rich symbolic system. Okay. When we move ahead in the same lecture, or probably in the series of other lectures, you will appreciate this a bit more, but what I am trying to say here is those are very good symbolic communication systems. Language is also a symbolic communication system, but there is a degree of sophistication that is unmatched here. Human languages, or the symbolic communication system that humans use, have peculiar characteristics which are not there in the symbolic communication system that animals use. So that is one of the basic differentiating features between animals using communication and humans using language. One of the things I sometimes say in class is that it is we who have decided what language is. So it kind of gives us that right to exclude everything else and tell that these species, they do not have language, only we have language. That is again, that is just for the fun, but one of the criteria is that the kind of complexity that we are talking about in communication systems is completely unmatched between the kind of communication systems humans use, or language that we have, versus the different kind of communication systems that these other animals use. That is one. The second is that so that is probably one of the more important things. The other aspect is that there is kind of communication that really happens using human language qualitatively. I am not really talking only about the symbols now, but the content in human language is very different than the content in animal communication systems. Okay. So for example, again something that I sometimes use in class is that animals probably do not really gossip. I mean humans gossip, they gossip all the time, they talk about different kind of stuff, they describe different kind of aspects of the world, but animal communication systems are mostly, if you observe, or if you look at it from outside, seems that it is more purposive and only purposive, and not really gossip wise and other things. So again, that is one aspect of the communication system that humans have, but probably the animals do not. Again, these might not be really very hard boundaries, and there might be some change, and at some point in time we kind of come up with this and say no, animals also have language, but there is a very interesting set of characteristics that human languages have, and which I am going to talk about right now, that will also probably help you appreciate the fact that why I am saying that humans have language, whereas other animals have very good communication systems. So leaving that debate right there, I am not really attempting to solve it for us, but what are the questions we can ask about language? So the first question, because obviously I have left you slightly confused in the last slide or so, the first question to be asked here is, what is language? When do we say that X has language or X does not have language? What are the defining features of language? So we will talk about that, and we will also talk about the fact that why are human languages unique and they are not really very similar to animal communication systems. Then we will also try and talk a little bit about what is the study of language called. So again, this is not really a course on language, but I will tell you that there is a complete field, a complete discipline that studies language. Obviously you know of linguistics, but where do psychologists come in? So when psychologists come in and they want to look at language and they want to see how language plays a role in overall cognition, the field is referred to as psychology of language, or in short psycholinguistics. So we will talk a little bit about what psycholinguistics is and what are the questions that psycholinguistics asks, and so on and so forth. And also, once we start asking that kind of a question, you can really look into language in a bit more detail. So you can ask, for that matter, And what are the different components of language? What all does language include? Does language include manual gestures? Does language include, say for example, gestures like winking, or does language include, non-verbal sound making and people making sense out of it, body language for that matter? We will ask those kind of questions. We'll probably ask that, what are the very significant aspects of language? Is it acquisition, production, comprehension, those kind of things. So, let us begin with a very simple definition, the most simple definition of a language that you will come across, and you will see this definition applies to some other kinds of languages as well. So, let me begin. So, language can be defined as a system of symbols and rules, and that enables us to communicate. So, there are only two things, there are symbols and there are rules, and the third is that there has to be something that needs to be communicated. Okay. So, the first is symbols. What are these symbols? There are different kinds of sounds, there are sounds combined to form words, then you can have things like intonations, sentences, those kind of things. These are the symbols of a language, those carry meaning and those carry information to the other person. Now, all of these symbols you will see are not arbitrarily put through in language. So, you will see the kind of sentences I am speaking right now, they are not arbitrarily arranged. So, if I am saying a sentence, there is a noun in the front, there is probably a verb following it and there is an object later. Suppose I have to say Ram eats cake. This is a valid way of saying, if I am seeing that Ram is eating a cake. So, I am saying Ram eats cake or Ram is eating a cake. Ram eating a cake is, if I say, then it is considered non-grammatical. Does not mean that you do not understand the meaning of it, but in more conventional description of language, if I say Ram eating a cake is, it will be considered ungrammatical. So, there is the issue of grammatical and ungrammatical, and there is where the issue of rules come in. So, you might have so many of these symbols, but so many of these symbols will need to be linked through particular sets of rules, and those rules basically are defined in the grammar of the language. So, we also need to know about rules of the language. The third thing which is very interesting about human communication is that there has to be things like needs, and suppose humans were self-sufficient organisms and they did not need others to talk to or to to procreate, to have food and do other things, then there might be a case if there is no intention or if there is no need to communicate, would there be any language at all? Now, that is again a slightly broader question, but it does tell us, and if you kind of take a deep breath, think again and try and describe language to yourself, you might see that even though you might have all the symbols that are needed, even though you know how to work these symbols through particular set of rules, unless you really want to talk, unless you really want to communicate, neither of these things can compel you to have a language. Again, somebody might be thinking of thoughts, but the idea is thoughts are probably just they are. I mean, there is no often no volition in thoughts, but the idea I am talking about is to communicate it to the other person, the second or the third or the fourth person. This aspect of needs, needing to communicate or wanting to say something, wanting to say, suppose I want a glass of water, I will ask somebody to fetch me a glass of water, that is also communication. So, one of the very important aspect of this definition of language is that language has to have at least three things. It has to have some symbols, it has to combine those symbols not arbitrarily, but using a set of rules, and there has to be something to communicate. So, there has to be something you would need to talk about, you would need to ask for, you would need to communicate. So, the simplest definition of language says language is a system of symbols and rules that enables us to communicate. I hope that is clear, and if that is clear, let us try and move to the next question. And the next question is, why are human languages considered unique? I was trying to explain that in one of the earlier slides, but let us look at this in a bit more detail. So, the idea is that animal communication systems, they lack the sophistication of human language. Again, I will really elaborate on the term sophistication in a while, but again it is basically trying to say that the differences in the way human languages are and versus animal communication are is not only in degree, but it's also in the kind of content that is talked about. It's very hard for me to imagine that a particular animal species might be creating poems or plays or other things in their symbolic communication, but humans do that, and human languages allows you to express your emotions in that particular way. It does not mean that other animals or other species do not have emotions, but human language kind of affords us the the possibility of talking about emotions in particular ways. So this degree of sophistication is completely unmatched with any other symbolic communication system used by any of the animal species that you come up with. So that is one. And the third is use of language. Again, I was taking a example of people gossiping, but in some sense that is interesting that people can really talk about because they just want to talk. There is no need to communicate. You are not dying and that you need water or something, but you just feel like talking to somebody, you just feel like communicating to somebody, and that is also a valid reason to communicate, and that is perfectly plausible and allowed and permissible in our language. So in this sense you can probably appreciate that there is so much of a difference between animal communication systems and human communication systems. Some of the examples I can take is honeybees. Basically they perform a certain kind of a dance, and that dance is considered is basically called the waggle dance. And one of the things that these bees would do is that they would move in figures of 8 when they would come back to their hive, and the idea is that if you can draw a perpendicular in this hive, this would in some sense indicate the direction of where the most food is, where the flowers are there, where most of the nectar can be sucked off. So again, this is one way of communication. Honeybees are communicating to other bees in the hive that this is where you will find food, but is this communication as rich as the communication that we would have? So for example, if you have to describe a restaurant to your friend, you will probably not only point, but you will share so many other things about that restaurant as well. So that is one. Vervet monkeys perform alarm calls to warn fellows against predators. So vervet monkeys they actually have very sophisticated alarm clocks, because we are talking of sophistication, and these alarm calls are when they see a airborne predator versus when they see a terrestrial predator. The alarm calls are slightly different. The alarm calls can be as specialized as say for example, if there is a leopard or a panther versus if there is a snake, their alarm calls will be different to indicate the two kinds of predators as well. So there is this sophistication there in animal species as well, but again it is not in any sense matched to the kind of sophistication that human communication system will have. So these things put together kind of help us to qualify that human languages are unique and they are very different from the kind of communication systems that animals are using. Also interestingly, people have had people have been occupied with this idea of teaching language to animals. People have had have been in trying for decades now to teach language to animals, and there have been different attempts. People have tried to teach language to birds, different kinds of parrots, etc. You might have heard of. People have tried to teach human language to dogs, probably to chimpanzees and to bonobo monkeys. And if really one has to bet that who will be the closest species to humans that can probably master the kind of language we have, then you will probably bet to one of the more closest genetic neighbors or genetic relatives of ours, and that is chimpanzees. So a number of scientists, Savage and Rumbaugh and so many others, have spent a lot of time, they have spent decades and decades of done research in trying to teach these human language to these chimpanzees, and these attempts have not really been very successful. So I would like to request you to go to YouTube and type these names, Washoe and Kanzi and Coco, and these were the chimps that people have been trying to teach language for a long time, 10 years, 20 years, 15 years, and you will see that the maximum language these chimps seem to have acquired is not more than 200 to 300 words. Now that is not the kind of language one really expects. Even human children of 3.5, 4 years of age have a vocabulary of more than this much. So, the idea is these efforts have also been completely unsuccessful, and it also kind of makes a case for human languages being rather unique as compared to other symbolic communication systems. If we kind of take the same argument slightly further, I have here a chart of differences between how apes communicate and how human children communicate. So, I will just pick up some of these things again you can pause and replay and look at this figure in more detail at some point. But suppose one of the basic things is that young children's 3 years, 4 years, 2 years children's language does involve things like displacement, temporal displacement and spatial displacement. What is temporal displacement? Human children can talk about here and now and there. Here and now, they can talk about yesterday and can talk about tomorrow and can talk about today. Human children can also talk about here, this space, and there, that space. Most of the efforts that have been spent on teaching this kind of language, teaching human language to animals, has kind of still shown that even these apes, even these closest relatives to humans, have not been able to master the idea of displacement, either spatial or temporal. So, that is one of the things, that their language does not have their utterances do not have a sense of here and there versus today and tomorrow. And that is one of the aspects of sophistication that I was talking about earlier. Also, there seems to be lack of a consistent syntactic or rule based structure in animal utterances as compared to human utterances. Human utterances, even very young children start producing sentences in a much more coherent way, in a way that is consistent with the grammar of the language that a child is learning. Suppose a child is born in an English speaking family, when the child starts to make sentences, 3-4-year-old children, quite often they will actually, it is not that they do not make errors, but quite often and mostly they will make sentences which are consistent with the syntactic structure of the language. That is not the case with animal utterances, apes utterances even. One of the other things is apes do need explicit training to learn symbols, So, they will not really pick up symbols just by themselves such as human children would. The entire vocabulary of the ape, you will have to spend some time and teach that one by one, symbol by symbol to the ape over a extended period of time before the ape can actually master this. That is not that's not the case with human children. Obviously, you initially tell them that this is this this is an apple, this is a cow, or this is a bird, and so on and so forth. But you will see human children kind of start picking up these symbols spontaneously, almost a lot of times without really any training. Also, one of the things is apes or these apes are basically not really able to reject ill-formed sentences. If you speak to an ape, like I was saying, Ram eating a cake is, the ape will not be able to reject that this is an ungrammatical sentence, but children, even young children, will be able to tell you that this is not the right way of saying it. Again, this might be happening slightly at a later age. Also, ape utterances, again I am kind of drawing from the efforts of these people to teach language to apes. One of the things they also observed is that apes would rarely ask questions. There is no spontaneous language production in apes, but human children, they a lot of times come up with questions, they ask a lot of questions, they are creating spontaneously new language. This one, and there are some others, are very major differences between ape language and child language, and this is something that also sets apart human languages as rather unique. So, let us move ahead, let us talk about characteristics of language. We have talked about the fact that human languages are unique, we have talked about the fact that what is language. Now, we do have some background about this. Now, let me go into a bit more detail and try and explain to you what is it that we consider language, what are the properties of language, and again this and how do you check that something is language or not, or say for example, how do you describe human languages. Now, C.F. Hockett in 1960, he listed around 16 general features or properties of human languages, and he is basically trying to describe communication systems, but some of them kind of apply really to human languages, and I will present a subset of those design features, and this paper is referred to as Design Features of Language, C.F. Hockett. You can find it at some place. Let us discuss some of the very important aspects of these that apply to human languages. One of the first things is semanticity. So, human language basically has this aspect of semanticity. One of the things is anything that you say in your language has to have a meaning. You do not say gibberish, you do not say things that do not make sense, and in that sense every symbol, every word in your language has to have some meaning. Only then it will be considered part of your language. So, most words, all words in your language will have meaning. That is the aspect of semanticity. Now, when I am talking about words having meaning, also I would like to point out this aspect of arbitrariness. It does not necessarily mean that the form of the word, the form of the symbol that you are using will have a direct correlation with the form of the referent. Suppose, for example, I am referring to a ship. Now, a ship is a small word, but you know a ship is a large animal. A crocodile is a bigger word, but in comparison to the ship, it is a much smaller object. So, it does not mean that if you have to signify a ship, the word should be as large in form, so that it kind of signifies the largeness of ship. These relations are almost arbitrary. Okay. So, the idea is arbitrariness basically says that it is not necessary, the words or the form of the words are not necessarily related to objects or events in the real words. This is a different world altogether, and that is a different world altogether, and we are kind of connecting this symbolic world to the world, the real world where the referents are. Another very important thing is any language, most languages are basically composed of discrete symbols. Say for example, English has around 40 to 48 different phonemes. These are different sounds. So, the entire English language, which might consist of infinite sentences that have been spoken and some of them that will come up afterwards. So, this infinite set can be broken down into these smaller segments, which are phonemes. 40 phonemes combined in various ways can actually explain the entire infinite language that there is. Okay. So, there is these discrete symbols that are there in the language. So, this is the third very important characteristic of languages. The fourth characteristic is duality of patterning. What is duality of patterning? Often if you really look at human language, you will see that there is a sense of double layering in this. Suppose for example, I am speaking to you in sentences and these sentences are made up of words. So, at one level these are words which have meaning, at the other levels at a slightly lower level these are phonemes which do not have a meaning. So, there is one level that is meaningful, but there is a level which constructs this level just below this one which has no meaning at all. So, these phonemes are meaningless units kind of combined with each other, and then you have with the combination of these meaningful units in words. So, this is duality of patterning. Another thing, another characteristic of language that we have been talking about, or I was referring to in one of the earlier slides, is called displacement. One of the very important features of human languages is that it affords us to talk about spatial displacement, that is here and there, and also it affords us to talk about temporal displacement, yesterday, today and tomorrow. So, this is one of the unique features of human languages that affords us to talk about yesterday and tomorrow. One of the most important characteristics, now coming to the most important characteristics of human language, is generativity. Now, generativity is basically, as I was telling you just now, that there are only 40 phonemes or 48 phonemes in English language, and you can combine all of these 40 phonemes into so many different ways that just these 40 phonemes, which is again a limited number of symbols, can really lead to the formation of an infinite language. There is some English language, some amount of English language that is already spoken, but there is always new people being born and speaking, creating more language. All of that, however, is just being created from this limited set of symbols. From a fixed number of symbols, you can generate infinite number of messages. That is basically what is referred to as recursivity or generativity. Okay. So, these are the 6 characteristics of language that are very important. Let me just repeat them for you to get a revision. Semanticity, the aspect that language has to communicate meaning, that is very important. The second is arbitrariness. The form of the language does not necessarily have to be related to the form of objects in the real world, that is 2. Third is discreteness. Any language is composed of discrete symbols, that is very important, that is the third. Fourth is duality of patterning. There is a meaningful level and there is a meaningless level, dual layers. Fourth is displacement. There is an aspect of spatial displacement and temporal displacement. Then there is fifth, that from a limited set of symbols using particular kinds of rules, you can create an infinite amount of language. So, these are the 6 very important characteristics of language. Again, this is not the entire set put forth by C.F. Hockett, but I have just put carved out a small subsample from there, which is going to be important in our understanding of language. Now, coming to the study of language. The study of language, as I was mentioning earlier, is referred to as psycholinguistics, psychology of language, and its major concerns can be summed up under these 4 broad areas. So, comprehension of language, production of speech, representation of language in the head, knowledge, concepts and those kind of things. We have talked about these things in some way earlier as well, and things like acquisition of language, reading, those kind of things. So, we are going to talk about in this week and the next one under these 3-4 headings, what are the important processes that come under language comprehension, what are the important processes that come under language production, and so on and so forth. So, this is all from me about introduction to language. I will from the next class onwards start talking about some of the more important aspects of language. Thank you.